Well, everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be talking about 223/556 and which bullet weight is going to be your number one go-to bullet weight if you had to go with one bullet weight only in a pinch. Now, conventional wisdom would state that the longer their barrel length is, whether it be a 22, 24, or 26-inch bolt-action rifle, for example, the longer the barrel length, you can take confidence in building a pretty stout position that a lighter, faster moving bullet is a great way to go. And conversely, on the other side of the spectrum, if you're in a real short barrel length 223/556 configuration, maybe a 10.5-inch AR pistol, for example, the shorter the barrel length, you can take confidence in a stout position that you might have that a heavy bullet is a great way to go. But what if your carbine is somewhere in the middle? What if you've got a 16-inch barrel length, an 18-inch barrel length? Then which way do you go? So in today's video, I've narrowed it down to four main bullet weights. It would be the 55 grain, the 62, the 69, and the 77 grain bullet weight. So this video, I'm going to tell you right now, it's probably not really geared toward Joe Reloader. If you are Joe Reloader, there could be still some pretty good info in it for you. But the number one thing that you should take away from this video is that if your name is Joe and if you do a lot of reloading, you should take it as a sign that you should subscribe right away if you haven't already done so. For the rest of you who aren't doing a lot of reloading, but you're just buying ammo right off the shelf, we're going to do our best to help you to decide which of those four bullet weights is probably the best way to go and why. So as always, if you like today's video, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications link if you haven't already done so. And as always, we're certainly looking forward to your comments. Thank you again. Okay, so what you're looking at is four different 223 cartridges. From left to right, you've got the 55 grain, that's by PMC Eldorado. Next, you've got a 62 grain steel case by Wolf. Next, you've got some PPU ammo, that's the 69 grain match ammo that they have. And then you've got a 77 grain matched bullet by IMI Razor Core. As far as when I took the bullets apart, the powder charges on them were as follows. You're looking at 23.8 grains of powder on that 55 grain bullet. It drops down to 20.3 grains of powder on the 62 grain. It goes back up on powder charge, or in powder charge rather, to 22.5 grains of powder on your 69 grain, and then up to 24.5 grains of powder on the 77 grain by the IMI Razor Core. Okay, from left to right, what you're looking at is the 55 grain boat tail full metal jacket. Next to looking at the 62 grain hollow point. Next to looking at the 69 grain match. Then you're looking at the 77 grain match. Now here's what's interesting. On the match ammo, the 69 grain and the 77 grain, when I weighed those on the digital scale, they both weighed 69.0 and 77.0 grains respectively. On the non-match ammo, on the PMC Eldorado, it weighed 54.9 grains, so it was close. But it got kind of wild on the 62 grain. What was supposed to weigh 62 grain, every time I weighed this bullet, it was consistently 63.3 grains. So something to keep in mind. Okay, we're going to start off by looking at the 77 grain bullet compared to the 69 grain bullet. One of the first things that we'll take a look at is the ballistic coefficient. The 77 grain bullet does have a more favorable BC. It's got 0.372 compared to a ballistic coefficient of 0.30 on the 69 grain. For those of you who may not know, the easy way of thinking of ballistic coefficient is as follows. It's just kind of a measure of how efficient is a bullet at retaining its speed and cutting through the wind without being deflected by the wind. That's pretty much the easy way of thinking about a BC. At any rate, the factory data would suggest that the 77 grain bullet is a little bit slower to start than the 69 grain. It's a speed of 2720 compared to about roughly 2950 feet per second although the 69 grain bullet does have a little more pure energy to start with at 1332 compared to 1265. But here's where it starts to get interesting though. When you get out to about 350 yards, at that point the race is too close to call in terms of speed. Technically speaking, you've got 1955 feet per second on the 69 grain bullet compared to 1939 feet per second on the 77 grain bullet. But take a look at the energy difference. You've got 643 feet per second on that 77 grain bullet. 643 foot-pounds rather, compared to 585 foot-pounds on the 69 grain. That's a difference of roughly 10% more energy. After that 350 yard mark, it's worth noting that the 77 grain bullet is always a little bit faster than the 69 grain bullet right on out to 1,000 yards. For example, at 500 yards, you've got 1653 feet per second on your 77 grain bullet compared to 1603 feet per second on the 69 grain. But take a look at the energy difference. You've got 467 foot-pounds of energy compared to 394 foot-pounds of energy. That is a difference of 18.5% more energy. So here's the question we've got to ask ourselves at this point, because these bullets both have a fair amount of drop. The 77 grain bullet at 500 yards is dropping 64 inches. The 69 grain bullet dropping roughly 59.5 inches. We've got to ask ourselves, are we giving up too much in terms of bullet drop and not getting back enough in terms of cutting through the wind efficiently with that 77 grain bullet? So let's find out. Let's bring in some wind numbers. And here's I factored in the 10 mile an hour wind left to right. And the numbers on the left are the 77 grain bullets. Numbers on the right, 69 grain. That's how much they're going to be thrown off in the wind. But rather than looking at every single wind correction number, I just like to kind of look at the over-under line. In other words, what are we giving up in terms of drop compared to what are we getting back in terms of being more favorable with our wind correction? So as we talked about earlier, that 350 yard mark, at 350 yards, if you want to be in that 77 grain bullet, you're going to give up 2.59 inches of of drop. You're going to drop about 2.60 inches more in the 77 grain bullet. What are you going to get back? You're going to get back 1.82 inches in terms of wind correction. If you're willing to take that trade-off, you'll have a bullet that has 10% more energy on arrival. What if you're not quite willing to take that trade-off? It's okay, I get it. Let's go up to 500 yards though. At 500 yards, you would give up 4.75 inches of drop if you want to be in the 77 grain bullet. It'll drop 4.75 inches more than the 69 grain, no doubt about it. What are you going to get back? 4.62 inches in terms of wind correction. That's a virtual dead heat. I think you have to take that trade at that point. If you are willing to take that trade off, you're going to have a bullet that has 467 foot-pounds compared to 394. That's 18.5% more energy. I think you pretty much have to take that trade. It gets even more interesting after 500 yards. Now after 500 yards, each of these bullets really starts to fall off the table in terms of drop. But nevertheless, if you were to shoot at 750 yards with the 77 grain bullet compared to the 69, you're going to give up 2.06 inches of drop. You're going to get back 14.3 inches in your favor in terms of wind correction in your favor. In terms of 1,000 yard shooting, it's both going to be in your favor. The 77 grain bullet will drop 24 inches less than the 69, and it'll be 28 inches better off in the wind. I'm not saying I would recommend you shooting out that far, but I'm just saying that's just an example of what happens after 500 yards pretty much. So realistically, you've just got to ask yourself, are you shooting 500 yards or closer, or 500 yards or further? I think if you're shooting 500 yards and closer, you don't get too much argument from too many people if you want to be in a 69 grain bullet. If that's what your rifle is shooting accurately, great. If you're going to be shooting further than 500 yards though, I think at that point the data becomes too overwhelming. I think you really ought to be in the 77 grain bullet if at all possible. Okay, next we're going to look at the 62 grain bullet compared to the 55 grain bullet. For starters, the 62 grain bullet has a BC of 0.307 and a ballistic coefficient of about 0.27 on your 55 grain offering. In terms of speed numbers right from the muzzle, the factory data does suggest that the 55 grain bullet is a little faster at about 3240 feet per second compared to 3020 feet per second on your 62 grain bullet. Foot-pounds of energy, about a dead heat, 1281 on your 55 grain, 1255 on your 62 grain bullet from the muzzle. Let's see where they're at about 200 yards though. At about 200 yards, you do have a little more drop on your 62 grain bullet, 3.25 inches compared to 2.73 on the 55 grain. In terms of speed, seems like it's going to be always a little bit faster on that 55 grain bullet until you hit 500 yards. At 500 yards, that's where it gets to be a virtual dead heat. But until then, the speed is always a little bit in favor of the 55 grain bullet. And at the 200 yard mark, the energy numbers 811 foot-pounds of energy for the 62 grain, 787 foot-pounds of energy for the 55 grain. You will have about 3% more foot-pounds of energy at the 200 yard mark in favor of the 62 grain bullet. At 300 yards, you've got 641 foot-pounds of energy on the 62 grain. You've got 606 foot-pounds of energy on the 55 grain. It's about a 6% improvement. 6% favors, 6% toward the 62 grain bullet. And at 500 yards, you've got about a dead heat on terms of your speed numbers, 1676 compared to 1673 with a slight edge to the 62 grain bullet. You've got 387 foot-pounds on the 62 grainer, 342 on the 55 grain bullet. So that's about a 13% edge in terms of downrange energy at that distance edge to the 62 grain offering. Take a look at the drop numbers though. You're dropping 55.69 inches at 500 yards on that 62 grain bullet compared to only a 50.69 drop. I say only as if that's nothing. That is still a substantial drop either way. But nevertheless, you've got about a 5-inch greater drop with the 62 grain bullet at that distance. Let's deal with some wind numbers now. When you factor in a 10 mile an hour wind, left to right, full value wind, the numbers on the left are for the 62 grain, how much they would be affected by wind. On the right over here, that's your 55 grain drop numbers. Again, rather than looking at every single number and every single column, let's just look at the over-under column. What are you giving up? What are you getting back? At 200 yards, you're going to give up a 1/2 inch of drop if you want to be in that heavier bullet. What are you going to get back? Roughly 2/10 of an inch. So about a 2.5 to 1 ratio against you if you want to be in the heavier bullet. But again, those numbers are so small, maybe that's not worth noting. At 300 yards, what are you giving up? What are you getting back? If you want to be in that heavier 62 grain bullet, you're going to give up about 1.5 inches in drop. You're going to get back about a 1/2 inch in wind correction in your favor. Notice that trend. It seems to continue. Even out there at 500 yards, what are you giving up? You're giving up 5 inches of drop if you want to be in the heavier bullet. What are you getting back? Only about 2 inches in terms of wind correction. It's about a 2.5 to 1 ratio, not in your favor. What happens though if we go out to this 750 yard mark? Things start to get a little better for the 62 grain bullet. At that point, you're going to give up 8 inches in wind, or I'm sorry, 8 inches in drop. But what are you going to get back? You're going to get back about roughly 7.3 inches in terms of wind correction, so pretty close to a dead heat. And you will definitely have more energy out there at 750 yards. In terms of 1,000 yards, not that I'm recommending you shoot that far with either of these 2 grains of bullets, but if you ever needed to, it might be worth noting that the drop and the wind are both in your favor if you're in a 62 grain bullet. At that point, you're better off by about 1.1 inches in terms of drop, and you're better off by about 15.43 inches in terms of wind. So really now we have, I guess, one last question. Would anybody really want to be in the 55 grain bullet when they could be all the way at the other end of the spectrum in the 77 grain bullet? Well, here's what's worth noting. If you look at the 500 yard mark, at the 500 yard mark, you're dropping 64 inches if you want to be in the 77 grain bullet. That's the most amount of drop that's out there. The least amount of drop that's out there is in the 55 grain bullet. You're dropping about 50.5 inches. Basically, you've got if you're willing to give up 13.69 inches in drop to be in the 77 grain bullet, how much are you going to get back in terms of correction in your favor? You're going to get back 4.61 inches in terms of correction in your favor. So what is that? Roughly a 3-to-1 ratio. So if you're willing to give up 13.69 inches to get 4.61 inches back in terms of wind correction, sure, the 77 grain bullet will hit 36.5% harder at 500 yards than the 55 grain bullet will. You just have to decide, do I want to give up 13.5 inches of wind of drop to get 4.5 inches of wind back? I don't know. That's a decision only you can make. But I think anything after 500 yards, regardless of bullet grain, you pretty much need to be in that 77 grain bullet. A lot of that depends on barrel length, of course, and maybe how well your rifle shoots those heavier bullets or lighter bullets. I'll let you make that call.